Okay, good afternoon. And we are going back a very, very long time of this. But it may be 114 years ago. Some of the issues from 114 years ago have never been resolved. Oh, that is William Howard Taft. He was president of the United States between 1909 and 1913, and he starts a baseball tradition. He is the first president to ever throw out the first pitch of the season back on April 14, 1910. There's a reason why he's there. Women are nagging him. They're nagging him big time because women want to vote. And he meets with the women in the morning and he gets so flustered. He said, "Get me out of here. Get me to a baseball game. Take me out to the ball game." That's what they did. But the women didn't give up. In the United Kingdom, in England, here are cops beating up a woman. Women wanted the right to vote. Women wanted to be heard. The wrong immigrants were coming. The wrong immigrants were ending up on Eldridge Street, where I was born, actually, on 67 Eldridge Street, and Norfolk Street, and Hester Street. The wrong immigrants are coming to the United States. The wrong immigrants are also coming to Canada. That is St. John. That is in New Brunswick. And that was one of the port of entries from Europe. There was Halifax, there was St. John, there was Montreal, there was Quebec, there was Boston, there was New York City, and there was Galveston, Texas, where the immigrants came in. I'm going to talk about that. The electric car. There was an electric car in 1910, believe it or not. Now you hear a lot about electric cars today. Did you realize there was one in 1910? In fact, it went back a little further than that, and that's a Baker. That was a car that was owned by, not this particular car, but William Howard Taft, President of the United States, had an electric car, the Baker. Jack Johnson was the heavyweight boxing champion of the world. That year he took on another fighter by the name of Jeffries. He beat him, and there were race riots around the country after Jack Johnson beat Jeffries in a fight. There was a race riot in Slocum, Texas, and death of 23 Negroes and 4 whites. There may have been more, there may have been less, but this is the Abilene, Texas Daily Reporter talking about what happened in Slocum, Texas, and they finally got around to put a plaque about what happened in Slocum only 8 years ago. The Mexican Revolution in Mexico. There was a Portuguese Revolution. I don't know why she's topless. This woman is topless. I have no idea why she's topless, but maybe somebody can tell me. But she's topless right in the middle of it.
She was just stupid.
No, well, it's a drawing. It's a drawing. So, anyway. See America First, and that is Glacier National Park. And in the See America First thing, a travel agency said, "Hey, why don't you go out and see America? America has mountains, so does Switzerland. Stay here." And that is Continental Divide. That's up in Montana at Glacier National Park, which was one of the first national parks in the United States. That is Frankenstein. That is Frankenstein. And this is Edison Kintogram. Edison Films to be released from May 11th to May 18th inclusively. One of Edison's films that year was Frankenstein. Frankenstein. Let's see, Herman Munster was Frankenstein. Boris Karloff was Frankenstein. So Frankenstein's been in the movies for 114 years. And this woman was the first movie star. Her name was Florence Lawrence, and she was the first person, at least in the United States, to ever be billed as a star of the movie. And of a movie. And does that look like Judy Garland? It's not. The Wizard of Oz movie came out in 1910. The first Wizard of Oz movie. It was 13 minutes long and there was no sound. And Father's Day Father's Day becomes a thing in 1910. Spokane, Washington, mother of the idea, wins point after 22 years of effort, the first Father's Day. And Halley's Comet, and you had a chance to see Halley's Comet around 1985, but it was a big deal back in 1910. Okay, so what is life like in 1910? And I'm talking about life for some of your mothers or your grandmothers or your grandfathers or your fathers. I don't know what year you were born, but they may have been kids in 1910. So what was it like in 1910 in New York? Well, the average life expectancy for a man was 47 years of age, 51 for a woman. Fuel for a car was sold at drugstores only. Only 14% of homes had a bathtub. And the rumor was William Howard Taft, who was the heaviest president, was stuck in the bathtub. It's only an urban legend. He was never stuck in the bathtub at the White House. 8% of homes had telephones. There were 8,000 cars on the road, and there were 144 paved roads in the United States. The maximum speed limit, I think I just did it coming here. I think I was going no more than 10 miles an hour. But the maximum speed in those days, 10 miles an hour. The tallest structure in the world was the Eiffel Tower. The average wage in 1910 in the United States was 22 cents an hour. Or today, $7.30 an hour. The average worker made it somewhere between $200 and $400 a year, which would be $6,600 today to $13,200 today. A competent accountant could get as much as $2,000 a year, which would be $66,000 a year. 1910, a noisy welcome brings in the new year. Vast throngs packed Times Square and Broadway to watch the 1910 arrival. That's when the ball came down, and that had just become really a New York tradition within the last 4 or 5 years at that time. A dentist, a good dentist, could make $2,500 a year, $83,000 today. Veterinarian, about $1,500, $50,000 today. And, well, $4,000 per year, $132,000 a year for a good veterinarian. Mechanical engineer, $5,000 a year, or $165,000 a year today. 95% of births took place at the home. That's where most people were born in those days. 90% of all doctors had no college education. Do you ever ask a doctor, do you have a college education? You ever ask them?
Yes.
Yeah, you have?
Yeah.
1910?
That's why I asked.
When did you go to school?
1910. Instead, they attended so-called medical schools, many of which were condemned in the press and the government as substandard. I'm not going to mention any doctors who I thought were substandard, but I had one for my teeth. Sugar cost 4 cents a pound, $1.32 today. Eggs were 14 cents a dozen, $4.63 today. Coffee was 15 cents a pound, about $5 today. $5 for a pound of coffee today. Just think of what you pay at Starbucks. You can pay $8, $9 for coffee. Most women wash their hair once a month. They use borax or egg yolks for shampoo. How would you like to use egg yolks for shampoo? That's what women did. Canada passed a law that prohibited poor people from entering into their country for any reason. Poor people. California, here I come. Well, the Southern Pacific Railroad's Sunset Route, New Orleans to San Francisco, come out to California if you could afford to travel. The 5 leading causes of death were pneumonia and influenza, tuberculosis, diarrhea, heart disease, and stroke. 2 out of every 10 adults couldn't read or write. 6% of all Americans, only 6% of all Americans graduated high school. The 1910 census, conducted by the Census Bureau, April 15th, determined that the population of the United States, 92,228,496. And most of the cities were along this route. The Great Lakes coming down through the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the St. Lawrence River, through the canals, and it was Buffalo, it was Detroit, it was Chicago, it was Cleveland, that were all big cities. In fact, here were the biggest cities back then. New York City had 4.7 million people, Chicago 2.1 million, Philadelphia 1.5 million, St. Louis, they had 687,000. Why? They're on the Mississippi, they're a port. Boston, 670,000 people. Cleveland, on Lake Erie, 560,000. Baltimore, another port, 558,000. Pittsburgh has the three rivers, has a steel industry, 534,000. Detroit, they're making cars there. It's on the Great Lakes, 465,000. And Buffalo. Buffalo is where the Erie Canal intersects with the Great Lakes, 423,000. At the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century, Buffalo had more millionaires per capita than any other city. Why? Because of the Erie Canal. So William Howard Taft's at a baseball game. That's okay. You know, he could go out and relax at a baseball game. It's April 14th, 1910. And he's there with his wife. And he wants to see a baseball game. But he didn't set out to see a baseball game that day. He's only there because his nerves have gotten to him. Because women were with him all morning saying, why can't we vote? Why can't we vote? Why can't we vote? The first sitting president throughout the first pitch of the season was William Howard Taft. That was April 14th in Washington. Taft wasn't supposed to be at National Park, but he was irate and needed a pick-me-up after a meeting with women all morning who wanted to vote. So he figured, I'll see a baseball game. Maybe it'll pick up my mood. Taft met with representatives who were in Washington that day for the 42nd Annual Suffrage Convention, and it had not gone well. During that meeting, Taft said, if women were allowed to vote, power might be exercised by the least desirable person. The hostilities he faced soured his day. So you think you would be the least desirable person to vote?
I'd shoot him.
Well, I wouldn't say that right now. Anyway, it was a beautiful spring day and the Senators were set to play the Philadelphia Athletics in front of a sold-out crowd in Washington. A who's who of Washington society were at the game. Before the game, the Senators manager, Jimmy McAleer, got the idea for Taft to toss out the first ball. While McAleer wanted the star pitcher, Walter Johnson, to catch the throw, the shy reserve Johnson declined the offer. Instead, catcher Gabby Street was chosen to receive the toss. And there he is. He's throwing out the first pitch, but he's not supposed to be there. Taft stood up from his seat, grabbed the ball, and got ready to hurl it toward the waiting Street. At the last minute, however, he surprised everyone when he turned and threw it at the unsuspecting Walter Johnson. Walter Johnson, for those of you who don't know, Casey Stengel, who saw all the greats between 1910 and 1965, said there were just two pitchers who he considered the greatest of all time. One was Walter Johnson, and the other was that Jewish kid from Brooklyn, Sandy Koufax. Johnson recovered in time to make the catch. The crowd went wild. Taft was happy. Women weren't bothering him, and he could watch a baseball game. Well, Taft goes back basically in Cincinnati to his hometown team, which was the Cincinnati Reds. And the Taft family supported the Cincinnati Reds. William Howard Taft and women voted. The people who were at the game, how many of you have gone to a baseball game and stood up in between the top of the 7th and the bottom of the 7th inning and do the 7th inning stretch?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, there is this tale about William Howard Taft, and he learned this in Cincinnati from Harry Wright, who was the manager of the first professional baseball team, Cincinnati Reds, in 1869. So the people who went to that game contended that the seventh inning stretch began at that game that Taft attended in Washington. As the story goes, the more than 300-pound president was uncomfortable in the tiny ballpark seat. It was only 19 inches. Today's seats are 23 inches. And got up in the middle of the seventh inning to stretch his legs. Seeing the president rise, everybody in the ballpark stood up as well. But the origin of the seventh inning stretch may have traced back to 1869 in a letter that Harry Wright, who was running the Cincinnati Reds, wrote. Here's the manager, and he said, "The spectators all arise between halves of the seventh inning, extend their legs and arms, and sometimes walk about. In doing so, they enjoy the relief afforded by relaxation from a long posture on hard benches." Taft was born in Cincinnati, September 15, 1857, and grew up in the city. Well, he's opposed to women voting, because you are, and we're mostly women here. So do you feel that you're the least desirable people to vote?
No.
No. This is 1910 thinking. This is 1910 thinking. Headquarters, National Association, opposed to women's suffrage. They had storefronts all around the country. Men running it saying, "We cannot allow women to vote." Taft was no fan of women voting. He said he opposed suffrage because women were too emotional. Women are too emotional. What do you think?
Could be and could be not.
How about men? Are men ever emotional?
Especially in a baseball game.
You were yelling louder than most.
The theory that Hottentots or any other uneducated, altogether unintelligent class is fit for self-government at once or take part in governments is a theory that I wholly dissent from. So if you're a Hottentot, you're uneducated, you're unintelligent, you can't vote. You can't vote. But this is the program from the 42nd Annual Convention, National American Women's Suffrage Association, Washington, D.C., starting on April 14th, ending on April 10th. Taft went to greet the delegates to the National American Women's Suffrage Association on, okay, we're good. Anyway, although he was given a standing ovation as he entered the room, as well as the end of his speech, the president was hissed at during the speech by some of the listeners. People were upset that Taft went to the convention. President Taft, by promising to address Women's Suffrage Convention, which opens in Washington tomorrow, has accused the wrath, or that's not accused, it's coached the wrath of tomorrow's, of the antis, who sent him a letter of protest. Do not go and speak to the women, even though you're the President of the United States. Taft said that he had been a little unsure whether he should come to the convention, since his views are not entirely in harmony with the NAWSA, but I consider that movement represents a sufficient part of the intelligence of the community to justify my coming here and welcome you to Washington. You're okay. You have some intelligence if you've come to this convention. I don't want to deal necessarily with riffraff, but you seem to be intelligent, so I'm here. Taft claimed that he was a strong and orthodox advocate of women's suffrage when he was in high school, which is going back to the 1870s. And that his father favored it as well. However, Taft said that the actual experience had modified his enthusiasm. Though women's suffrage seemed to work reasonably well in sparsely populated western states, that might not be the case if it was won in the densely populated eastern states, which meant, well, you know what, you in Colorado, you're okay. You in New York, you in New Jersey, you in Pennsylvania, you in Ohio, well, that's my home state, but you're not good. Now, it's not going to work. Too many women, it's going to screw everything up. If I could be sure that women as a class would exercise the franchise, I would be in favor of it. At the present time, there exists in my mind considerable doubt. This is the President of the United States saying that women are too stupid to vote and too emotional. He said his hesitation about endorsing universal women's suffrage had to do with the possibility that the vote would not be exercised by the vast majority of women, but used only by that part of the class least desirable as political constituents, and may be neglected by many of those who are intelligent and patriotic and would be desirable members of the electorate. In other words, most women were way too stupid to vote. Way too. What do you agree with Taft or not? Did Taft just get your vote? You gonna vote for him in 1912 when he comes up for re-election? Don't think so, huh? Okay, President Taft hissed by women's suffragettes. He was hissed. They didn't like him. That brought out the hisses and the retort by the president. Listen to this. Now, my dear ladies, is there anything condescending about that? Now, my dear ladies, you must show yourselves equal to self-government by exercising listening to opposing arguments, that degree of restraint without which successful self-government is impossible. So he's telling off the women. Stop booing me. Stop booing me. Don't do that. Anyway, votes for women, the standard of the women's suffragettes. Before 1910, women who organized for women's rights thought of themselves as member of the women's movement. This label signified their desire to move beyond the domestic sphere of life into social welfare activities and political equity, or equality rather. Does that sound like Betty Friedan 50 years later? And her movement, the National Organization of Women? They believe women's special, even superior traits as protectors of family and home would lift all of society to a higher moral level as a result of their participation. Around 1910, some of those concerned with women's roles in society began using a new word: feminism. Feminists. 1910. Did you hear that in the 1960s? That term, feminist? It's been around. It's been around. They thought less in terms of duty and morality and more about rights and self-realization as women. They believed that all women should unite politically and socially because of their shared disadvantages as women. Women's rights, women's suffrage party, right there, those people who are demonstrating. May 21st, some 10,000 New Yorkers gathered in Union Square on 14th Street to demand that women receive the right to vote. The rally, the largest women's suffrage demonstration yet held in the country, symbolized New York City's increasing prominent role in the national movement for votes for women. Lincoln said women should vote. Actually, he didn't. However, it was used as a slogan in the state of Washington. 75 years ago, Abraham Lincoln said, "I go for all sharing the privileges of government who assist in bearing its burdens, by no means excluding women." Kind of didn't say that. Washington State voted to approve full women's suffrage, a vote that was influenced by publications and posters. One poster declared Lincoln said women should vote. Poster quoted Lincoln as have said, "I go for all the sharing privileges of government who assist in bearing its burdens, but no means excluding women," except there was more to the quote. I go for all sharing the privileges of government who assist in bearing its burdens. Consequently, I go for admitting all whites to the right of suffrage, who pay taxes and bear arms, by no means excluding females. Lincoln was never known as an advocate for voting rights, and also all whites, no blacks, all whites. Lincoln, of course, would change his tune eventually. And this is London. And these are cops basically beating down on women. Black Friday was a suffragette demonstration in London on November 18th. About 300 women marched to the Houses of Parliament as part of their campaign to secure voting rights for women. The day earned its name from the violence meted out to protesters. Some of it sexual, like rape, by the Metropolitan Police and male bystanders. Why not? They didn't care. During January's general election in 1910, H.H. Asquith, the Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Party, promised to introduce a conciliation bill to allow a measure of women's suffrage in national elections. When he was returned to power, a committee made up of pro-women's suffrage MPs from several political parties was formed. The committee members proposed legislation that would have added 1 million women to the voters' rolls. Except, too bad, I'm taking it back. He reneged. He had opposed votes for women as early as 1882. And there is the Prime Minister, H.H. Asquith. November 18th, following a breakdown in relations between the House of Commons and House of Lords over that year's budget, Asquith called for another general election and said that Parliament would be dissolved on November 28th. The Women's Social and Political Union, or the WSPU, saw the move as a betrayal and organized a protest march to Parliament from Caxton Hall in Westminster. Lines of police and crowds of male bystanders met 300 female protesters outside of the House of Parliament. The women were attacked for the next 6 hours. Many women complained about the sexual nature of the assaults, which included having their breasts twisted and pinched. That's a young Winston Churchill. Churchill!
Oh, is nice looking.
Winston Churchill. He's a young Churchill. You might say he's nice looking, but you probably wouldn't have liked him. Police arrested 4 men and 115 women, although the following day all charges were dropped. The Conciliation Committee were angered by all the accounts and undertook interviews with 135 demonstrators, nearly all of whom described active violence against the women. 29 of the statements details sexual assault. Calls for a public inquiry were rejected by Winston Churchill, then the Home Secretary. Churchill did not think women had the right or should have the right to vote. The violence may have caused some subsequent deaths of 2 suffragettes. The demonstration led to a change in the approach. Many of the members of the WSPU were unwilling to risk further violence, so they resumed their previous forms of direct action, such as stone throwing and window breaking, which afforded time to escape. So if somebody's out there, they throw a rock at the window, I can barely see who they are, they break the window, they run away, I can't get outside to see who they were, so that's what they did. Police also changed their tactics during future demonstrations. They tried to not arrest too soon or too late. Votes for women. Votes for women. H.H. Asquith took a detached view of the women's suffragette question, believing it should be judged on whether extending the franchise would improve the system of government rather than as a question of rights. As a woman, should you have just the right to vote, yes or no? What do you think? Of course.
Of course.
But
No, but
not in those days.
not,
And
so they
and
should.
according to some politicians who are out there today, women should lose the right to vote. A guy from Tennessee, a legislator from Tennessee, recently said we should be taking the rights away from women to vote. He did not understand, Asquith, why passions were raised on both sides of the issue. Alice Paul. Heard of Alice Paul? She's got a museum in New Jersey. And Alice Paul becomes eventually a major women's voting rights activist in the United States. Where did she learn that? Where did she learn that? In England. Alice Paul realized that being polite and asking sweetly for the right to vote was not getting women anywhere. and that radical tactics were necessary. For a woman, that might mean standing on a street corner, holding a sign, or speaking from a stage. Those were considered radical acts. Paul was arrested 7 times and imprisoned 3 times in England in 1908 and 1909 after moving to England and getting involved in the English women's suffrage movement. She returned to the United States in 1910 and turned her attention to the American suffrage movement after the deaths of Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1902 and Susan B. Anthony in 1906. The suffrage movement was languishing, lacking focus under conservatives, suffrage organizations that concentrated only on achieving state suffrage. Paul believed that the women's movement needed to focus on the passage of federal suffrage amendment to the United States Constitution. Taft's America is changing. Lower East Side of Manhattan. The Lower East Side of Manhattan. If you notice, really crowded. Really, really crowded. In fact, it was the densest area in the world at that time. More people crammed into that space than anywhere else in the world. And around the country, people are seeing pictures like that. And they're beginning to say, what is going on in New York City? What is happening with immigration? As more and more immigrants poured onto the American shores, a rising wave of discrimination against immigrants began to arise. Immigrants were blamed for contributing to the social economic problems that were common in industrialized societies such as poverty, crime, labor unrest, and overcrowding. Congested tenement buildings in which a majority of immigrants resided were seen to foster violence and disease and further burdening social programs, charities, and police forces who tried to maintain order. There was a strong xenophobic reaction, and this was a group known as nativists. They strove to maintain the national character and believed that the arrival of mass arrival of Irish, Italian, Japanese, Chinese, and Jewish immigrants would pollute this character. It would ruin the United States, in their opinion, which was, in their minds, an Anglo-American country. In their assessment of the multitudes of immigrants flooding American shores, nativists saw only a deluge of poor, uneducated, religiously and linguistically dissimilar people who would never be able to assimilate and would destroy American culture with their foreign lifestyle. Taft didn't seem to be a nativist. Taft, Ellis Island, and America is changing. During Taft's first year in office, 1909, I love when people talk about my family got here and they got here because they had to go through a series of things. Not true. 1909, no passports, no visas needed to enter the United States. No papers required at all. This was the paperless period. All you had to do was verbally give information to an official, whether it was in Boston, whether it was at Ellis Island, when you boarded in Europe, when you were boarding a ship to Boston, or to Ellis Island, or to Nova Scotia, or Halifax, or Quebec, or Montreal. You boarded the ship, and the information was the only information they used when you arrived. If you had your papers in order on the ship, you were able to get in. 1907, 1,004,056 immigrants entered the United States. The reason why the immigrants came, a strong domestic economy in the U.S., the Russian pogrom, outbreaks of violence against the Jews. In 1907, the biggest number of immigrants came from Italy. They were Italians. The nativists wanted just Western Europeans as immigrants. Something had to be done. These are people coming into the United States. We don't want them. Of the 4.7 million people that made up the New York City population, 3/4 of the population were immigrants or first-generation Americans. Unlike earlier immigrants, the majority of the newcomers after 1900 came from non-English speaking European countries, like my grandfather. He knew very little English when I dealt with him, but he came from Lublin, which is now Poland, and he learned enough English. My wife's grandfather knew like 6 words of English. That was it, didn't care. Anyway, the principal sources of the immigration was now Southern and Eastern Europe, especially Italy, Poland, and Russia. How many people have family that came from, where did they come from?
Italy.
Italy.
Yeah.
Italy. Do you know all this, by the way?
But it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
I'm old now.
Yeah.
And they came easily, and they lived together in New York.
This is the story of your family. What I am telling you is the story of your family.
Okay.
So anyway, and those countries were quite different in culture and language from the United States, and many immigrants had difficulty adjusting to their new lives. Did they have difficulty, or were they able to?
No, they had no problems at all.
They had no problems.
And they pushed their kids
Yeah,
to get
yeah.
to school.
To
school. Never mind play.
School. Go to school. America's changing. That's illustration in Ellis Island after Iacocca poured all that money in to restore Ellis Island. The United States had difficulty absorbing the immigrants. Most of the immigrants chose to settle in American cities. Why? Jobs were located there. As a result, the cities became more crowded. In addition, city services often failed to keep up with the flow of newcomers. Most of the immigrants did find jobs, although they often worked in jobs that most native-born Americans would not take. Sounds like the argument you hear today in 2024 or 2023, right? Anything changed? This upset people when they saw all these people living together in 1 or 2 rooms. It was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people in this little tenement. Urban life was filled with hazards for new immigrants. Housing could be one of the greatest dangers. Most immigrants lived in tenement houses, narrow, low-rise apartment buildings that were unusual or usually grossly overcrowded by landlords. Cramped, poorly lit, under-ventilated, usually without indoor plumbing. The tenements were hotbeds of vermin and disease, and frequently swept with cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis. For Italians, and I'm using Italians because they were the biggest group that came to New York City at that point in 1910. For Italians, this way of living came as an enormous shock. In Italy, many rural families had slept in small, cramped houses. However, they spent most of their waking hours outside the house, walking, working, socializing, and taking their meals indoors. Again, another tenement on the Lower East Side. By the way the Lower East Side was segregated, the Italians lived west of Forsyth Street, the Jews lived east of Forsyth Street. Forsyth Street was the dividing street. Jimmy Durante came from Forsyth Street. The next street over, Eldridge Street, Ira Gershwin came from Eldridge Street. In New York, they found themselves confined to a claustrophobic indoor existence using the small same room for eating, sleeping, and working. A substantial percentage of immigrant families worked at home performing piecework, that is, doing work that paid them by the piece, such as stitching together garments or hand assembling machinery. In a situation like this, an immigrant woman or child might go for days without seeing sunlight. Immigrant workplaces were unhealthy as well. A substantial number of Southern Italian, where'd your family come from? What part of Italy?
A part of England.
No, where'd they come from? Where they live in Italy? Northern Italy.
Northwestern Italy.
Okay, northwestern. Well, anyway, a substantial number of Southern Italian immigrants had worked as farmers and thus were qualified for unskilled and more dangerous urban labor. Many Italians went to work on the growing city's municipal works projects, digging canals, laying paving and gas lines, building bridges, and tunneling out the New York City subway system. 1890, nearly 90% of the laborers in New York's Department of Public Works were Italian immigrants. Well, it's changing. It's changing. By no means was all Italian immigrants' work grim and hazardous. Italians found work throughout the city in many of the impoverished trades that had long been a haven for immigrants, such as shoemaking, masonry, bartending, and barbering. For a time, some observers felt that the Italians operated every fruit vendor cart in the city. For many immigrants, though, especially women and children, work could only be found in sweatshops, the dark, unsafe factories that sprang up around New York. William Howard Taft goes to synagogue. He is the first American president ever to go to synagogue. He visits Rodolph Shalom in Pittsburgh, and that is spelled right, by the way, without an H. Between 1891 and 1911, Pittsburgh did not have an H at the end of its name because of bureaucracy in Washington. They said every town named Pittsburgh was spelled without an H. But Pittsburgh said we had an H when we were founded. They got back their H in 1911. Anyway, so he's there. It was the first time, it's May 29, 1909, first time a sitting president spoke from the pulpit of a Jewish house of worship during regular Sabbath services. Taft had come at the invitation of Rabbi J. Leonard Levy, and his short speech to an overflowed crowd at the temple that day emphasized his intention to be the president of all Americans, except that they were black, maybe women. Not welcomed in Canada, that's Montreal, that's a statue in Montreal. Not welcomed in Canada. Well, the Canadians decided we don't like poor people. Poor people stay home. The Canadian Immigration Act of 1910 expanded the list of prohibited immigrants and gave the government greater discretionary authority concerning the admissibility and deportation of immigrants. Immigrants determined to be unsuited to the climate or requirements of Canada were prohibited, as were those sponsored by charitable institutions. All immigrants of Asian origin were required to have $200, which would be 2,650 Canadian or $1,925 US today, in their possession before being permitted entry, while all other immigrants, male and female, were required to have a minimum of $25, which would be $660 Canadian or $475 US today upon their arrival in Canada. You go to that building in Halifax, Pier 21, that's where immigrants came, and you took, well, the train is that way, but that's a mock-up in front of the pier. You took the train, you headed out to Montreal, headed out maybe to Toronto, maybe if you were Jewish, you headed out to Winnipeg, or you came in St. John's, New Brunswick, where Louis B. Mayer from MGM came in. Under the Immigration Act in 1910, the list of prohibited immigrants expanded. The act also introduced the concept of permanent residency, where an immigrant could obtain that after residing in Canada for 3 years. Until permanent residency was granted, an immigrant could be deported if they became classified as undesirable. And these were the undesirables: prostitutes, pimps, vagrants, inmates in jails, hospitals, and insane asylums. Under the new act, political dissidents advocating for the forceful overthrow of the government and those attempting to create public disorder were also subject to deportation. My son has an electric car. He has a Tesla. But long before Elon Musk, there was this car, the Baker. That's a 1909 Baker electric car. Taft doesn't have an energy policy, except he has an electric car, which meant that I don't know why he had an electric car, but he bought an electric car. The electric utility industry, which evolved from the gas and electric carbon arc commercial and street lighting system, began around 1880. when Thomas Edison's Pearl Street Power Station started generating electricity in Lower Manhattan. Its main purpose to provide power for one of Edison's most famous inventions, the light bulb. Station provided electricity to 59 customers, but the industry was slow to grow. At the beginning of the Taft presidency, less than 2% of the United States had electricity. 2%. Taft was the first president to own and drive cars during his presidency. One of his most interesting cars that he owned was green. It was a Baker Electric. This electric vehicle was popular with women in that era, as it did not require that cranking up the engine and was virtually maintenance-free. Taft administration purchased the 1909 Baker model as one of the White House first automobiles. Steam-powered, white and 2 gasoline-powered Pierce Arrows were also included. The Baker had been around since 1895. Electric cars were around in 1895. Walter Baker made investments in the battery charging infrastructure, but the electric car never caught on. Baker's first car to market was a 2-seater, the Imperial Runabout, priced competitively at $850, about $32,000 today. Which will buy you an electric car today? Around $32,000. So the cars have not gone up in price since Baker introduced it. It was first shown in New York at the city's first and the nation's first auto show in 1900. How many of you can't live without this?
I can remember seeing pictures.
It is the bathroom. It is the toilet. Indoor plumbing,
It had a
1910.
top too.
Yeah, well, when I lived in Eldridge Street as a kid, the water was up here and the bowl was down here. It might still be that way for all I know there. The modern toilet was invented. There were other types of water closets before then, but it was this toilet that changed the game forever. The toilet design started changing away from the elevated tank into the modern toilet with the tank coupled to the bowl. Most Americans didn't have indoor plumbing. 1999, I gave a talk at Central Michigan University in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, right in the middle of the state. And I was brought in by this guy by the name of Walter Schneider, who was about 60 years old at the time. This is 25 years ago. And he grew up in Southwest Michigan, and he told me the first time he ever saw indoor plumbing was when he went to college. He went to college, which would be around 1960. That's the first time he ever saw indoor plumbing. Fight, racism, and censorship. This is a fight between Jim Flynn and Jack Johnson. Ticket for that in 1912, that particular ticket. Jack Johnson caused a problem in the United States. After heavyweight boxing champion Jack Johnson's 1910 victory over James J. Jeffries, the Great White Hope. Anybody see the play, The Great White Hope on Broadway? Back with James Earl Jones. Anti-black, anti-boxing crusaders blocked local screenings of a film that showed the match. The $20 ringside seat would cost $660 today. Jeffries came out of retirement to challenge Johnson. He had to lose 100 pounds to get to fighting weight. The fight of the century took place on July 4th, 1910, in front of 20,000 people at a ring built just for the occasion in downtown Reno, Nevada. Johnson defeated Jeffries in the 15th round. Jeffries boasted he had never been knocked down in a fight before, fell 3 times to Johnson's punches, and was being counted out when his manager called the fight. This fight goes on film. It would go on film, and this would become a problem. It is the first censored film in the United States. That is Reno, Nevada, which builds itself as the biggest little city in the world. The outcome of this fight triggered race riots that evening all across the United States, from Texas to Colorado to New York to Washington, D.C. Johnson's victory over Jeffries had dashed white dreams of finding a great white hope to defeat him. Many whites felt humiliated by the defeat of Jeffries. Blacks, on the other hand, they're jubilant, celebrated Johnson's great victory as a victory for racial advancement. Riots erupted in New York, Baltimore, Pittsburgh. That's wrong. They didn't have the H then. I gotta fix that. Philadelphia, New Orleans, Atlanta, St. Louis, Little Rock, Houston. Riots occurred in 25 states, 50 cities. 20 people killed across the U.S. from the riots, hundreds more injured. The fight, racism and censorship. The fight's promoter, George Tex Ricker, who ended up bringing the first National Hockey League team to Madison Square Garden in 1925, also refereed the bout, and he also had the exclusive film rights. The film was recorded by 9 cameramen and is 2 hours long. Jeffries Johnson's World Championship Boxing Contest film, released the year of the fight, received more attention in the United States than any other film to date. It was the most talked about film. Many states and cities banned the exhibition of the film. The movement to censor Johnson's victory took over the country within 3 days after the fight. Meanwhile, in Texas, a place called Slocum, Texas, Palestine, Texas, 18 Negroes killed by whites. On July 29th, a white mob of hundreds massacred black residents around Slocum, Texas, a black majority community near Palestine, Texas. According to some estimates, the mob killed as many as 200 black people in the span of 2 days. Hundreds more fled the area in the aftermath of the massacre, forced to leave their homes and farms and businesses behind. How did it start? People don't really know how it started. There are a couple of theories. Local white citizens formed the mob after a series of minor events they perceived to have violated racial hierarchy, including a black worker being appointed to the position of authority on the nearby road construction. It does not appear that the Jack Johnson fight had anything to do with the incident, even though it happened right after that. Armed members of the mob rode through Slocum and the surrounding area on horseback, firing at any and all black citizens they encountered. They chased those fleeing into the forests, into the marshes, shooting many of them as they ran. Cavalry to quell outbreak in Texas, special trained Russian troops from Austin. More trouble is feared. The Negroes were unarmed. Most newspapers downplayed the extent of the violence and claimed that the white mobs only shot at the black citizens after being threatened. However, subsequent investigations found that the massacre was wholly unprovoked. A local sheriff commented to the New York Times that white men were going to go about killing Negroes as fast as they could find them. These Negroes have done nothing wrong that I could discover. They hunted the Negroes down like sheep. While at least 11 members of the mob were arrested and 7 were indicted, no one was ever prosecuted or convicted for their role in the massacre. Well, what did William Howard Taft think of the Slocum massacre? He's only the president. On August 13th, a group of about 150 ministers from Washington, D.C. Wrote to Taft and the American people urging action in response to the massacre in late July of the African Americans in Slocum near Palestine, Texas. Their letter, "We have come together to make a sane protest to the reason and enlightened conscience of the great American people. We deplore the fact that a meeting such as this should be necessary. An impartial enforcement of law and unprejudiced treatment of citizens, regardless of ancestry, would leave little excuse for a meeting like this. Unless something is done to make human life more valuable and law more universally respected, we feel that our beloved country is doomed to destruction at no distant date." Well, Taft was, no, not my problem. Not my problem. Tell the states. History has documented that Taft was no fan or friend of civil rights for blacks. Mexican Revolution. The Mexican Revolution began with a call to arms on November 20th to overthrow the current ruler and dictator Porfirio Diaz-Mori by Francisco Madero. When the wealthy northern landowner Madero challenged Diaz in the 1912 presidential election, Diaz jellied. After Diaz declared himself the winner for an 8th term in a rigged election, Maduro ended up escaping jail, went to San Antonio, Texas, called for the overthrow of the regime in the plain of St. Louis Potosí, sparking the the Mexican Revolution. And there is Maduro. Diaz was he was ambitious, wanted to develop Mexico into an industrial, modernized country, while he worked on implementing a capitalist society, building factories, dams, roads. The rural workers and peasants were greatly impacted. There is Diaz. Diaz resigned using a campaign of bullying. Diaz reigned using a campaign of bullying, intimidating citizens into supporting him. While civil liberties, such as freedom of the press, suffered under his rule, the greatest injustice came in the form of new land laws. In an attempt to strengthen ties with the United States and other influential foreign interests, Diaz said, hey, land, you know what, you own that land, you don't own it anymore. We're giving it to Americans and other wealthy non-nationals. In addition to this, no Mexican was able to own land unless they had a formal legal title. Small farmers were rendered utterly helpless. There was no option but an uprising. Madero persuaded Pascual Orozco and Francisco Pancho Villa to join the revolution. Meanwhile, in Portugal, there's a revolution. After years of turmoil and disapproval of the monarchy, on October the 3rd, the Republican uprising took place in Lisbon. At first, many Republicans didn't want to take part in the uprising. However, enough succeeded to be successful. There were nearly 2,000 armed soldiers and sailors rebellion between October 3rd and 4th. The government was expecting military help from other parts of the country by October 4th, but it never arrived. The rebels also managed to control the military so they would not be able to receive help. They disconnected telegraph lines, cut down communications with units outside of Lisbon, so they never received their orders. And that is the Portuguese Revolution. Rebels also cut off railway tracks so that troops outside the capital could never arrive on time. While it was possible that the military from Setúbal could arrive, the rebels were able to control the Tagus rivers with their ship. The military was now able to fight the rebels, having to declare the republic and the fall of the monarchy on at 9 a.m. the next day in Lisbon City Hall by Republican Jose Relvas. King Emmanuel II fled. Many casualties. It was but it was a peaceful coup. From bombings and shootings, many didn't sustain injuries. However, it's not really known how many people died during the Portuguese Revolution. On October 6th, the government newspaper, Diário do Governo, announced to the Portuguese people, the Constitution of the Provisional Government of the Republic today, October 5th, at 11 o'clock in the morning was proclaimed by the Portuguese Republic in the Grand Hall of the Palaces of Lisbon municipalities after the end of the National Revolution Monument. The provisional government was in charge by October 8th. See America First. It's Glacier National Park. 2015, me and my wife sitting in Glacier National Park. Glacier National Park, Montana, was established May 11th when President William Howard Taft signed a bill into law making it the 10th national park in the United States. And May 11th is also the start of an American domestic tourism campaign aimed at wealthy Americans. Spurred by the development of the Great Northern Railroad, the park helped begin the See America First campaign to encourage U.S. tourists to visit Western states and territories instead of going to places like Switzerland. The park's creation was a result of a collaboration between conservationists, including George Bird Grinnell and Lewis Hill of the Great Northern Railroad. Grinnell, who nicknamed the park the crown of the continent, was inspired by the area's glaciers, alpine terrain, and wildlife, a portion of the former Blackfeet Reservation was sold to the federal government in 1895 and became part of the newly established Glacier National Park. Frankenstein. How many of you have seen Young Frankenstein or Boris Karloff or Herman Munster? The Munsters, remember the Munsters?
I remember.
You remember Boris Karloff? He wasn't the first. In fact, this guy doesn't even really look like Boris Karloff. But Frankenstein. Frankenstein is an American short, silent horror film produced by Edison Studios in the Bronx. It's where Thomas Edison was. It was directed by J. Shirley Dawley, who also wrote the One-Reelers screenplay, broadly based on his scenario on Mary Shelley's 1918 novel, Frankenstein. The short motion picture is generally regarded by film historians as the first screen adaptation of Shelley's work. It premiered on April 9th. How many of you have heard of Florence Lawrence? You have?
Yeah, but I don't know why.
You don't know why?
That's one reason I came, yeah.
You've never heard of Florence Lawrence, everybody else?
Well, I have now.
You have now. She was the first movie star. She was so popular that the studio was putting her name on their posters. The first film star to be honored. She had been in film since 1907. The honor came thanks to a ruse created by IMP studio owner Carl Leon, who planted a rumor in the press that Lawrence, then shooting the film The Broken Oath, had been killed in a car accident. Once the news headlines had spread, he published an ad revealing that Lawrence was alive and well and soon to be seen in a new motion picture. She was the first star, but actually she wasn't. How many of you watched The Wizard of Oz?
Oh, yeah.
How about this version?
I don't recognize that.
You don't recognize it? It's out there. You go up on YouTube and you can watch it. It is 13 minutes long. It is the first Wizard of Oz. And the Tin Man's there and the Scarecrow is there. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, also known as The Wizard of Oz, is the earliest surviving film version of the L. Frank Baum 1900 novel, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. The film was made by Selig Polyscope Company without Baum's direct input. This is 13 minutes. Dorothy Gale. Who is really Dorothy? Judy Garland or is it B.B. Daniels? First Dorothy was B.B. Daniels. And Imogene the cow are chased by Hank the mule. I don't remember Imogene the cow or Hank the mule in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz from 1939, do you? Well, anyway, Dorothy runs to the cornfield and discovers that the family scarecrow, Robert Leonard, is alive. They realize a cyclone is approaching, so they all hide in a haystack. And that's basically the movie. That is basically it. Dorothy and Toto, Hank, Imogene, and Scarecrow were all swept to the land of Oz, where soldiers get scared by the witch, Mamba, who attacks the Wizard of Oz because he is a threat to her reign. How many of you have given out Father's Day cards? How many of you sent Father's Day cards? Well, that's what they told me, and I said, that's got to be a lie. I'm not a terrific husband and not a terrific father. Yes, you are. Anyway, Father's Day was founded in Spokane, Washington, at the YMCA by Sonora Smart Dow, who was born in Arkansas. It's the first celebration was in Spokane on June 19th. Her father, a Civil War veteran, William Jackson Smart, was a single parent who raised his 6 children there. After hearing a sermon about Anna Jarvis's Mother's Day at Central Methodist Episcopalian Church in 1909, she told her pastor that fathers should have a similar holiday honoring them. Although she initially suggested June 5th, her father's birthday, the pastors of the Spokane Ministerial Alliance did not have enough time to prepare the sermons, so let's do it the 3rd Sunday in June, and it's been that way ever since. Halley's Comet. How many of you saw Halley's Comet in 1985? It was around 1985. 1910. Many feared the end of the world is at hand. Hooray, we dodged it. Coming end of the world. Overcome by gas from Halley's Comet. Halley's Comet, here tomorrow. People thought the comet was going to hit the Earth and the Earth was going to explode. And that'd be the end of us. You wouldn't be sitting there listening to me. Streaking toward the Earth after a 75-year absence in January, Halley's Comet was reported in the popular press as an evil eye of the sky, creating mass hysteria, the public fearing it would snuff out all life on Earth. Opportunistic entrepreneurs hawk anti-comet pills. What's in an anti-comet pill? What do you take? Comet, if the comet hits you, you're dead. Gas masks and comet protecting umbrellas. You're going to hold an umbrella like that as the comet's hitting you? People bought it. In the end of May, the event proved to be harmless while marking the first use ever of a spectroscope and the first photographic documentation of the comet's signing. Well, here's the legacy from 1910, the comet's sighting. Most American women did get the right to vote because of the constitutional amendment in 1920 that Alice Paul pushed. Not all American women got the right to vote in 1920. In 1920, Native Americans were not allowed to be United States citizens, so the federal amendment did not give them the right to vote. With the passage of the Snyder Act in 1924, American native-born women gained citizenship. But as late as 1962, individual states still prevented some women from voting by the use of literacy tests. Poll taxes and claim that residents on the reservation meant one was not a resident of the state. Native-born Asian Americans already had U.S. citizenship in 1920, but first-generation Asian Americans did not. Asian American immigrant women were therefore excluded from voting until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, which allowed them to gain citizenship after 3 decades following the passage of the 19th Amendment. The poll tax was eliminated in the United States in 1964. Parliament Qualification of Women Act was passed, allowing women to be elected to Parliament in England. In 1928, women in England, Wales, and Scotland received the right to vote under the same terms as men over 21 without property requirements as a result of the Representation of the People Act in 1928. Ellis Island. The Immigration Act of 1917, better known as the Barred Zone Act, is best known for the creation of a barred zone extending from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, which no persons were allowed to enter the United States. Its main restriction consisted of literacy tests. Can't say literacy. I guess I'm illiterate. Intended to reduce European immigration. Jews got in. They could read the Torah. And if you could do 45 words in your native language, you got in. The Emergency Quota Law, 1921, was enacted because of fears of increased immigration after the end of World War I and the spread of radicalism propelled Congress to enact this emergency measure, imposing drastic quantitative caps on immigration. This was the big one. The Immigration Act in 1924, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, was enacted to further limit immigration. This law established extended national origins quotas based on the 1890 quota, highly restrictive, 1890 census, highly restrictive and quantitatively discriminatory system. The quota system would remain the primary means of determining immigrants' admissibility to the United States until 1965. 1930-31, the Canadian government responded to the Great Depression by applying severe restrictions to entry. New rules limited immigration to British and American subjects, agriculturalists with money, certain classes of workers, and immediate families of Canadian residents. The electric car, the 100-mile Fritchel electric. By 1935, electric cars had all but disappeared from the road. 1976, the United States Congress passed the Electric and Hybrid Vehicle Research, Development, and Demonstration Act to support research and development in electric and hybrid vehicles. Electric cars today is a big business. Donald Trump gave Jack Johnson a pardon. On May 24th, 1908, he pardoned Jack Johnson, convicted, violating the Mann Act in 1913 by taking his white girlfriend across state lines. Johnson surrendered to U.S. authorities in 1920. He served 10 months in prison. Johnson's story was the focus in the Pulitzer Prize-winning Broadway play, The Great White Hope, starring James Earl Jones in 1969. 2006, Unforgivable Blackness, The Rise and Fall of Jack Johnson, was turned into a PBS special. Finally, something talking about the Slocum Massacre. It only took 106 years for Texas to recognize it. January 2016, after more than 2 decades of applications, letters, and record requests, a historical marker was unveiled to remember the Slocum Massacre. The official end of the Mexican Revolution is often to be taken as the creation of the Constitution of Mexico, February 7th, 1917, but fighting continued through the 1920s. The First Republic of Portugal lasted between 1910 and 1926. May 28th, 1926, the parliamentary republic was overthrown in the bloodless military coup, and the first European long-lived authoritarian system was introduced. You recognize that from the 1939 film. The 1939 film Wizard of Oz was a box office failure. Did you know that? It was heavily criticized by critics, but it became a beloved classic movie when CBS aired the movie on November 3rd, 1956. Florence Lawrence was not the first movie star. That was a French actor by the name of Max Linder. She did appear in about 300 films, various motion picture companies throughout her career, and she faded into obscurity by the 1930s. Mary Shelley, 1918, Frankenstein, has influenced popular culture for 2 centuries. The work has inspired numerous films, television programs, video games, derivative works. Halley's Comet. Nobody was killed by Halley's Comet in 1910. Nobody was killed by Halley's Comet in 1985. Halley's Comet is the only known short-period comet that is constantly visible to the naked eye from Earth, appearing every 72 to 80 years. It last appeared in inner parts of the solar system in 1986, and will next appear, and hopefully we'll all be here to see it in 2061. And Father's Day became a national permanent holiday in 1972 when I was the one, Dick Nixon. Next month you get more of Dick Nixon, I bring him with me. That was me. 1972, I'm not sure if it was before Watergate or after Watergate, but Nixon signed a law designate the 3rd Sunday in June as holiday. Any questions, any comments? Your turn to talk.